You talked about flying into a high-threat environment. Of course, one of the things that's been part of the strategic process all along is the offense-defense calculation. And the Soviet Union invested a tremendous amount of effort in its air defenses. And one of the ways that we responded to that over time was with standoff missile. I mean, we responded to it in trying to develop different penetration techniques and jamming capabilities and all of that. But just talking about bombers for a moment, we also responded with standoff missiles, Alchem's and that kind of thing. And when the Carter administration made its announcement that it was canceling the B-1 program, basically what it was behind that was you had the air-launched cruise missile that would be carried by the B-52, but you also had the stealth bomber, the stealth program. Everything stealth at the time was a black program that was under development for some point in the future. Let's talk a little this offense-defense calculation and how that affects what you do and the cost of what you do.
Yeah. Well, you know, in past, offense has always had the advantage that it's in the air. That is, I can build more ICBMs with more warheads a lot cheaper than you can build an effective missile defense. But in the case of the bomber force, we were well aware that at that time, I think the estimate was that the Soviets were spending about 17 billion US dollars a year on air defenses. Well, in that era, $17 billion worth of rubles was a lot of money. And so we were very interested in keeping them making a large investment in air defenses because we were more and more understanding that for penetration we were not going to be relying on the bomber. They didn't know that. So the Air Force really had mixed responses to President Carter canceling the B-1A. In the first place, the Air Force didn't think it was the right bomber. So then there was a reason why Jimmy Carter was able to cancel it. On the other hand, the Air Force was really unhappy that they canceled it because that told the Soviets that you don't have to spend all that money on defense. And we were sort of in a dilemma about, we as the Air Force leadership, was sort of in a dilemma about how to deal with this because the Congress was asking hard questions. But then President Carter rescued us before he left office. He announced the ATB. So he declassified the Advanced Tactical Bomber, which was clearly a penetrating bomber, and clearly one that would require enormous air defense investment. So that solved our problem. And then the next administration resurrects the B-1. So, whoops.
A lot of critics, we'll get back to acquisition and cost, a lot of critics say that we just won't be able to afford everything we're trying to buy for the triad. And so you get into this debate about one leg versus two legs versus three legs versus what's the right size.
Well, you know, I won't give you a statistical defense. I detest the word affordable. People say something's not affordable. They don't really mean that. They mean it's not a high enough priority for me to commit to it. If you look at the total cost of modernizing the strategic triad, the total cost of operating the strategic triad was less than 5%, well under 5%. So if the national leadership declares this is job one, this is the underpinning for all of our national security, then it cannot be an affordability issue. Now, are we going to be able to buy modernized nuclear weapons and the modernized force for less than what people are advertising? No.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's going to cost.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the sticker shock comes from people that have not calculated 20 years of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at what we paid for the B1B per article, 204 million each. If you advance that to when we'll deliver the B-21, that's over 500 million, just inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So when people throw these numbers around, they need to always factor in what's my real priority. If it's priority one,
Mm-hmm.
it cannot be an affordability issue. Now,
Mm-hmm.
should I get it as efficiently as possible? Of course.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not an affordability issue.
Maybe this is the right place to quit looking at platforms and begin looking at the weapons themselves, the weapons complex.
Okay.
We started with the Manhattan Project, and we came out of the war, and there was a period of uncertainty, and then we basically settled into a rhythm in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. In fact, President Truman had put most of this in place before he left office in terms of the kind of nuclear enterprise, for want of a better word, the design laboratories and the Nevada test site, as well as the Pacific facilities, which we then quit using when we went away from from testing except underground, and the production reactors and all of that. And the culture that was built up to kind of define what we did in that was driven in many ways by nuclear testing. And then, of course, we come to about the time that you retire as Chief of Staff and come to IDA, and the United States ends nuclear testing. And although we have not ourselves ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, although we've signed it, which was negotiated several years after Congress basically mandated the end of nuclear testing, the chances are very slim that we're going to return to it. And so the nuclear enterprise had to react to that and kind of reorient its culture and come up with different ways of doing things. And so now you're post-Chief of Staff, but you're at IDA and you're doing all the advisory committees. I won't list them all, but I know that you were on the Lawrence Livermore Advisory Committee with Johnny Foster looking at a lot of these issues. And coming forward, you've been on almost every nuclear enterprise study that's been done since then. Can you say a few words about the nuclear enterprise?
If we look back at the way that the enterprise operated before, actually it's well before 1990, but I think 1990 was when it became apparent that we were not going to test anymore, or at least soon after that. But whether we ratified or not, the president said we're not going to test, and the next president said we're not going to test, so that pretty much settled whether or not we were going to test. But I think it was instructive that just before we stopped testing, that the nuclear laboratories were offered the opportunity for 5 more tests. Said, you can do 5 more tests and then we're through. They couldn't decide on what to do with 5 more tests. In other words, they said, well, what is it we can learn that we need to learn from 5 more tests? And they could never come to agreement, so that just passed us by. That, I think you have to look back on how we did it before to understand what it is that we perhaps really gave up. And that I asked a leading designer once, because I always think in terms of inputs and outputs. That is, how does a nuclear weapon work? You have an electrical input that ignites the HE, and the output of the HE is a compression of the pit, and that's the input to the pit, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we really truly began to look at how to deal with sustaining the nuclear weapons without testing, that a group of us challenged a bunch of designers to put things in 3 pots. One pot is, what is it about that sequence that leads to a nuclear explosion? What is it about it that we understand first physics principles we know? What is it that we don't understand but know how to understand? That is, we know how to do the research to understand that. And what is it that we don't understand and we don't know how to understand? So they put that in these 3 pots. So we then went from what became science-based stockpile stewardship, created by Vickery's, really, to answer this center pot. And then we went to, well, how do we deal with this? And that is, stay with the test pedigree. Then we sort of redefined test. What was a test? Did we ever test anything to a statistical probability? How certain? And so it turned out the tests at that time were terribly important because we didn't try to understand things that we had 1,300 tests and didn't bother to understand this. So we went from the attitude is, I'm going to have this tremendously important demonstration that gives me confidence, I don't care which pot it's in, that it's going to work. You can't do that anymore, then what do you work on? So we set out to do science-based stockpile stewardship. And the result is we know more about the health of the current stockpile than we ever knew when we were testing. Now, will we be able to maintain it forever without testing? I don't know. If you ask the laboratory directors, what can you identify that could go wrong that would require a test? They will say, we don't know. We know we have to be able to maintain the capability to do that someday. But right now, I don't have anything that I need to do that can be fulfilled by a test. We'll say that's an enormous accomplishment. That's not where we were in 1990. That's where we are in 2016. Enormous investment, enormous amount of work in those 3 laboratories that has taken place over that 26-year period. That gets us to the point is we can modernize the stockpile with very high confidence that it will work and it will have the characteristics we care about.